Hi, it's Tom here at FDS, and today we're going to be looking at abrasives and prep for paint in Nerf, and also the kinds of tools and abrasives you'll use for shaping mods and body extensions and alterations. As you can see, I've got here a flat top which is for my son. I've been building this forever, one day I'll finish it for him, probably when he doesn't want it. And as you can see, it's got a variety of finishes on it, so it's a good thing to demonstrate exactly what you might use for which jobs. It's about 80% done on the bodywork. There's all the fill to do in the prep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by breaking down for you the kinds of tools and abrasives you need for shaping the shell and prepping it for your fillers, and removing things like the annoying digicam, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to look at the kind of abrasives you need to prep for paint and the sort of finish you should be aiming for before you paint a Nerf blaster. And I only use automotive paints. If you're looking for a tutorial on how to use vinyl dye, go somewhere else. All of this stuff is based around using auto-grade spray paint, either in cans or preferably from a gun. But I recognise not everyone's going to have a gun and compressor. The same applies to airbrush paints. If you're using any kind of airbrush primers or spray primer, the prep is pretty much the same. So let's start off with abrasive tools that we use for shell shaping. So we've got hand files. Now these, I think, are better than Dremels. The reason I don't use Dremels for shaping is because I work in my house and Dremels throw stuff at 20,000 RPM all over the place. Very dusty, very dirty tool. Also they're 70 quid. This hand file was like, I think I paid $10 for a set of 4 different shapes. And this is a medium file. It's not a really heavy warding file, it's a medium file. Now the use for these is for shaping things like this. You can see here this edge. It was a flat square edge cut on a 20-ton guillotine. So I needed to get a bit of a shape to match the contour of the shell, and you just literally run the file like that, and that shapes, that does all your rough shaping. And the other use for these is when I'm building flat tops, where these cuts are here, to get them absolutely level, a flat file is a really good tool because it's flat. So you can use this flat edge for anywhere where you want a good flat surface, and you can also rasp. It takes plastic off really quickly, and it's very, very accurate. You don't get the wobbly edge. If you look at the edges under that glue, they're almost completely flat. Now I don't have any special skill with hand filing. It's not like a kind of masterclass job. It's also useful for places like this where you want to take away little bits of moulding. And this is like a first cut file, so we don't use this for final prep because, as you can see, the teeth are coarse and they leave all these little indents in. So that's the downside about these, is that they're really only for shaping first cut, and then we'll move on to the other things. So there's a round file, which is again a coarse first cut file, and that is for doing holes, expanding holes, and anything where you want a round tight edge corner. The other type of file that you might use, which I use quite often for things like voltmeter holes, is this, which is a needle file. You can see this one's got some filler embedded in the end of it, and the easy way to clean that out is to use a soft wire brush on your drill and just clean it out, or you can heat them up and then wire brush them, but I like to just wire brush them off. So that's a needle file. Again, this is a really cheap needle file because plastic's soft. You don't really need very, very expensive Swiss needle files. I think the whole set of these was under £5 or less than $8 if you're in America. Probably much worse by now. The pound's collapsed thanks to our idiot politicians. The less said about that, the better. So there are the 3 types of file that I use. So if we're moving away from files and we want to get on to our next stage, this is oxide paper. This is 120 grit. The grit's always printed on the back on sandpapers, for those of you who don't know. This is an oxide paper. This is green. Oxide paper is often white, and it's made from aluminium oxide abrasive, hence the name. And this is not really a sand as such. You do not want to go any stiffer than 120 grit for Nerf, because the scuffier the grit and the much harder the abrasive, the more likely you are to leave permanent marks in your soft shell. And then when you come to paint, and those of you who've read my little quote in Out of Dart's excellent book, will see that my quote about paint was that paint doesn't hide anything, and that's true of the prep, and that's why we're doing this video. So this would be used to prepare this surface, and what I've got here is a cork block, and a block you use for large flat areas. If you're working on a smaller flat area, you can use a smaller block. You can buy these cork blocks relatively cheaply. You can cut them up into different sizes and different shapes. You can also make curved profiles in them, and you can get rubber blocks in different sizes too. You can use the ends of your fingers, but be aware that if you use the ends of your fingers, you're putting more pressure on the pad point here, and then in between the finger pads is an area where there'll be less pressure, so you'll get an uneven sand. And that's particularly noticeable in filler. And when we've seen my filler video on what fillers to use, I always use a block to get flat finish. If you want a flat filler, you need a block because it keeps the pressure even. So you would use these for the next stage of this kind of shaping, where you can see we're being relatively coarse onto this stuff, but what it's doing is it starts to remove those lines left by the warding files and by these first cut files, and it does then start to produce a smoother surface. Obviously sanding takes time, there's no shortcut with sanding. You can use one of those like palm sanders, triangle palm sanders, if you've got one of those that you like to use. They're quite good for some of this kind of stuff, the smaller ones particularly if you want to automate or if you're an American and you love power tools. Personally, I still like to hand sand a lot of stuff. I'll use a power sander for some heavy, if I want to do a lot of radiusing and I can't be bothered to sit there for hours. But with a hand sand block, you get a much better finish. There's a reason my stuff's so flat, because it's all hand blocked. You can't get that with the machine because the head oscillates like this, and it leaves little tiny whirl marks into the paint. And also, the beds on those palm sanders are very rarely perfectly flat if you've had them for any time, so they don't provide such a good finish. When your block gets worn, you can cut your block down or change it out, and you can really keep an eye on it. So that's oxide paper, and this will go right down to 240. So if you're dry sanding, oxide paper is very good. This is also my first cut for filler, so if you're doing any kind of epoxy filler, then this should be your go-to shaping sandpaper, and it doesn't clog as quickly as other papers. That's why I use oxide paper for filler, and you can brush the layers off again. If you use a little brass wire brush, or hand one, you can take back all of the filler that beads up onto the top of the oxide paper and refresh it. You'll find this lasts a lot longer than traditional sandpapers. Do not use sand like grit wood style papers on anything Nerf. You won't see me ever use any of those, even if I'm desperate. I'd rather walk to the shop and buy this stuff than use the glass paper, because glass paper is very bad for Nerf. It just doesn't last very well. It's not designed for any kind of curves, and it's hideous, and you can't get it in the finer grades. So oxide paper, again, dry paper. When you sand filler, sand your initial filler prep, do it all dry. I don't do any wet prep until the final stage. So then you've got a dry surface always for building up your filler layers and skimming up and doing your guide coats and stuff.